Hey, we're going to take a look at the amendments to the Constitution. So we begin here with Amendment number 1. It talks about the 5 basic freedoms that are guaranteed. I'd encourage you to make sure that you go through the original language as you read through the amendments and that you understand a little bit of what the specifics are in each one of the phrases in Amendment number 1 and really through all the amendments as well. Make sure that you read it carefully as you go through your Constitution reading. So I'm going to run through these very quickly. We have the freedom of religion, which in its intent and the way that it's interpreted is that we should not have a state-sponsored church. Clearly, this is a controversial one, especially when it comes to the separation of church and state. However, you will not find that anywhere here in these amendments. You will find that the separation of church and state was actually a separate letter that was written from Thomas Jefferson to the Baptist of Danbury Baptist Church. They were concerned about the involvement of the government in their church, and he wrote back to them and said that there will not be there will be a separation of church and state. It is not actually found here in the amendments. So, unfortunately, that has been interpreted in a number of different ways, but according to the way it was originally written, no state-sponsored church. The freedom of speech is number 2, or the second of the freedoms in Amendment number 1. Which allows us to criticize the government. There are 2 elements to the freedom of speech. There is both slander and libel. Now, slander is verbally defaming a person, while libel is doing that same thing but in writing. And those things are prevented. You cannot do those things even though you have freedom of speech. You can't defame somebody or tear them down publicly in order to ruin their reputation. That is limited. And there are certain freedoms of speech that are limited, especially when it starts to infringe on somebody else's freedoms. And so you got to be careful about that. You also have freedom of the press, which is the freedom to print and to write your opinion. There's the freedom of assembly, and that way everybody can have their own meeting places. They can meet, but it must be peaceful. That is very clearly pointed out. So when there are peaceful assemblies and marches, there's really nothing the government can or should do about those, but when they turn violent or they infringe on rights of others, that is definitely an area of concern. We also have the freedom to petition, which is, again, a peaceful protest of the government. It should not turn anything but peaceful. Amendment number 2 is the right to bear arms. And so there's not a whole lot that needs to be said about this one other than it's very controversial today. And there are a number of people who are trying to interpret it different ways. I will leave that up to you for right now, but you need to know that this does protect Americans' rights to own guns. And it is Amendment number 2. Amendment number 3 is the quartering of troops. I mentioned this in class, but the quartering of troops has never been brought up in the Supreme Court. It's considered to be one of the more dormant of all the amendments, and for the time being does not seem to have any major bearing on current issues, but it does prevent the government from requiring troops to be housed in your home. Number 4 is illegal search and seizure, which means that the government cannot search your home or private property without a warrant. And if they do so and they obtain any sort of evidence, the judge may rule that it is inadmissible. There are exceptions to this, however. If there are times where the evidence would have been recovered with a proper warrant, the judge may rule that it is still admissible. If there are other pieces of evidence, they may also allow that. So it's open to interpretation. I'm not concerned that you know all the different exceptions in there, but generally they cannot search without a warrant. Number 5 is very packed full of a lot of stuff. And so in number 5, I encourage you to make sure that you read through it on your own as well. I'm just going to hit some of the major ideas that are in Amendment number 5, the rights of the accused, as well as the idea of government acquisition of land. The first part of the rights of the accused is the idea of a grand jury. So grand jury means that we are going to have a group of people who are going to weigh the evidence before it goes to trial. The trial is where you are determined whether you are guilty or innocent. The grand jury does not do that. They are simply looking at evidence obtained by the police. Then they are going to figure out whether there's enough evidence to take you to trial and to spend taxpayer money on that. So grand jury, then they have a choice whether to deny that for continuing on to the petite jury. And the petite jury is the one who would then take the case to determine the guilt or innocence. So they can pass it on, or they can stop the proceedings right there and say, there's not enough evidence here, let's just throw the case out. The double jeopardy clause is one that prevents you from being tried twice for the same crime. Now, if you go rob a donut shop and you get thrown in jail, and then you get out of jail and you go rob another donut shop, that does not apply here, because that is a new criminal act, and so therefore you can have a new punishment. It does mean that once you get tried for that robbery of the donut shop once, for that same event, you cannot be tried again. There are some exceptions to this again. There always seem to be exceptions, but if this were something that covered both a state and a federal level offense, it could be tried in both the state level courts and the federal courts. It could be tried in two different states if they both argue over jurisdiction. That's pretty rare, but it could happen. But generally speaking, once you're tried for something and convicted, you cannot be tried once again. Self-incrimination is the one that number 5 is often associated with. I plead the fifth means that you cannot be a witness against yourself, or they can't force you to be a witness against yourself. And that's essentially protecting you from saying something that is going to be used as evidence against you. Unfortunately, the way that our society often views this is that if you plead the fifth, they think that you are trying to hide something and automatically associate guilt with that person. That's not the way it's intended, not the way it should be interpreted, but many times they do. Due process of law is the guarantee that you will have a fair trial. Due process comes up again in Amendment number 14, but it is originally put in here number 5. I'm not going to go too deep into that for the purpose of what we're doing now. In eminent domain, this is the government acquisition of property. This is in Amendment number 5 as well. This means that the government can take your land for public use. And if it's something that's going to better society, such as a roadway or some sort of transportation, a government project that is going to benefit all of society, and they can rationalize it that way, they can take your land without your consent. Now, they have to pay you fair market value for that. And oftentimes the government will pay you above the fair market value, but you don't have a whole lot of recourse. There's not an appeal process that is generally going to be successful in these cases. The only way that you would win is if you can prove the fact that the government is doing this for selfish reasons and not for the good of the entire community.